Entity Framework has some support to working with views, to read from the data, but does not have support to manage view lifecycle like creating, updating, very similar how it does with the tables. Now this is I'm going to try to do in this video, show you an automated way how to manage view lifecycle, and this method I have been using successfully for my past years, and I want to present because it's a setup which I do in most of my projects. So what I would like to do is I would like to have my SQL queries for the views in a separate file, so in this way I could easily modify the text and copy and paste very easily to a text editor to run that query and to be efficient. And I don't want to put this SQL query in a C# code because I could do that, but I don't want to do that. And as you can see here in this example, you can have very complex queries. For example, this one, it's a recursive CTA, which is impossible to do in Entity Framework. So this type of queries I would like to use in views, and this is the reason I highly recommend to use views, but in the place where the speed is very important and efficient. So I'm going to start with an interface, which I'm going to name of iQuery view. This will be placed in my storage provider. And this interface, I have a property with query, which will be returning our query, which I have seen here previously. And I use clean architecture, but this method works with any type of architecture. I do have here a separate project for infrastructure where I'm planning to have my Postgres views. By the way, I'm using Postgres, but this method works also with SQL Server or any type of provider that Entity Framework supports. So my special Postgres queries are here. And I do define an interface here in my storage layer because I am not respecting the clean architecture by the book, and I do have a couple of violated concerns. So this Entity Framework configuration like value converter, my DB context should be outside of my application layer, but I'm gonna not focus on this. So in my infrastructure concern, I do define an interface which is iQuery view, and here I'm gonna start to write some code. So I have created a class which I name Postgres View Migration, and I'm gonna start to write some code. So now the code which I'm gonna write, I'm gonna explain how migrations work. So if you're gonna look here to a couple of migrations, we do have here, let's consider this one. So this is a migration. All the migrations, they inherit from a migration class. Now this class, we're gonna use it also in our methods, and it does offering a couple of methods, which we're gonna use that. So actually, I'm going to use migration. So I'm going to come back to my SQL class here, and I'm going to inherit from migration. Now, just in the start, I do have, let's say, override up, right? Because this is the method which is overridden by the Entity Framework. And here, if I'm going to go to this, I do have a couple of properties. So every migration, it offers you the active provider, which is the provider like Postgres and so on, but also it gives you access to the model. For instance, we do have a property which is called target model. So here you can read properties from the model like entity types. So these are the entities which are registered in Entity Framework. So we can read some information, for example, with find entity type. And this is a entity type which is offering, and then returning this call, you have a couple of methods. For example, if it's a view, you can get the view name and so on. So I would like to use this migration class and to use built-in metadata for Entity Framework. And the first one is I would like to create a view. So the query that will allow us to create the actual view will have this syntax. By the way, I'm using Postgres view migration because I'm going to use Postgres syntax. If you're going to use this something else, this should be dependent on the provider. So this is the migration builder which we're going to run scripts on. So the syntax, it looks like that. And I have to write this method get qualified name and instance. So this will be our query, and let's continue to write some code. So first I want to create an instance of this query, the interface which I have shown you here. So this one. And I'm gonna create an instance, and I'm gonna use reflection because the speed is not important. So create instance, and I'm gonna use, I need the configuration, and I need something like here, as query view. Now the config I have to specify here in this migration. So the config, it will be the link between Postgres and our view configuration. And I'm gonna explain just in a moment. So this will be our config. And the config, I'm gonna use entity framework configuration class. So this will be our config. And I also need the entity. So it will look something like here. And the entity will be a class. So that's pretty much our signature. And if our configuration does not implement iQuery view, then we're gonna throw an exception. So here we have the query, which we're gonna explain how we read it, and let's read the view and the schema name. For that, I'm just gonna paste some code and I'm explaining what it does. So we're gonna read from the target model, which is from the migration class I have explained previously. We're gonna read the entity type, which we have specified here specifically to the view. Now, if this model is not registered in entity framework, then we're gonna throw an exception. We're gonna get the view name, that's the name, and the schema, also offering. And then we're just gonna use escape, and I'm gonna use the Postgres syntax. So if we're gonna not have the schema, then we will just return the name. Otherwise, we're gonna return the schema along with the name and also separated by the dot. And be careful, in Postgres, the syntax escaping it's with double quotation marks. So that's basically our entire migration. Now let's jump to the configuration. This is the entity type configuration for our view. I'm gonna use the same interface, entity type configuration, which I'm gonna also use it for the table. This is the Fluent API notation. We'll have no key, and this will be the view name. And then the same syntax applies. So you can use property, you can also use conversion, you can use the column name. So you basically the same way how entity framework, the configuration, it also applies here. So here I'm only interested to these columns. Now, in order to work, this view, this configuration has to implement that interface. Otherwise it will throw an exception. So I'm going to implement this interface, and then what I'll do, I will have a property here to query. So here I have to return the query here, but I wanted to have here as a separate file. Now I can use actually a hack, and I would like to get content from this file, which is residing here. So here I'm gonna use a function, which I have already loaded here. So what it does here, it goes through the assembly, and this file, it will be added as embedded resources. So we will use reflection. This is my assembly, which I'm gonna have loaded here, my infrastructure assembly. I'm gonna throw an exception if it doesn't found, and I'm gonna read the manifest, and I'm gonna read the content to the end and then return as a text. Now the key here, it's actually this has to be embedded resource. So this has to work. So all my SQL files here, it has to be embedded resource, otherwise the resource will not be found, so an exception will be thrown. So this will be our view name. Our view definition will look something like here. And right now I would like to use in the code. Now my current setup in on model creating, it's using this applying configuration from assembly to read all those configurations which I have defined here through reflection when the model is creating. So in this way I can define as many interface, and this will be loaded by default. And this is our model, which is mapped through the view. I have a private constructor because we'll never create this CBV ancestor because it will be always read. And I do have here a property very similar how it works to tables as well. And the way how we're gonna perform query, it's actually the same. We're just gonna go select from, and we're gonna read from here, and that's pretty much all. So all the syntax that you know for entity framework will be applied. Now we have not used anywhere else the Postgres view migration, and the key here is I would like to add to tell entity framework to use this class. So the way how we're gonna do that is we're gonna add a migration like the old way. So I'm here in the package management console, I'm using add migration, I'm gonna give a name. And because this migration does not have any pending changes, this will be empty, so this is perfect. Now what I'll do, I'm just gonna add and use this class. So I'm gonna go to copy the name, I'm gonna place here, replace, and I have to specify here the view model. And this is the entity configuration, and this is the entity as well. And here you have to remove this up because this will be created, are already overridden by the base class. And to make this class actually even easier, I'm gonna define abstract, because there's no way to instantiate this. Doesn't make any sense. So that's the reason I'm going to define as abstract. So that's pretty much all how you add a migration with a view. And what will happen when we'll update the database in the app, when this migration will be applied, it will execute this create or replace view as a query. And on down, by the way, I have not implemented the down. I'm going to just do in a moment. So for down, for this type of tutorial, I'm gonna just leave down as drop view. The disadvantage of this method is that will not support version. Actually, we can support versions, but for this tutorial, I'm gonna make the video way too longer. However, I'm gonna tackle that in a later video, but that's pretty much all. Let me know in the comments what you think, and have you used this method successfully or not? I'm Daniel, and until the next time, see you soon. Bye.